I'm gonna try and unpack the framework for two projects and their relationship with my interests, practive and narrative processes, and kind of just help everybody kind of think through those things and then go into the two projects. So I'm naturally curious about the world of ecology, wildlife, and how it intersects with the architectural practice. And this curiosity crosses a number of thresholds, some forensic practicalities, some systems design, and some speculative theory. The two projects that I'm going to talk about, my brother Ernest and Illusions of Occupation, are both narrative-based and could easily be taken at face value as strange, imagined worlds devoid of any concrete grounding. I think that the readings are more easily digested if you have an understanding within the context that I situate my work. Fundamentally, I believe in the importance of being earnest about your preparation and training when trying to establish a future for your practice. This is not to say that you cannot redefine or manipulate or adjust your narrative, but rather that more often than not, you are already subject to a fascinating and rich narrative of your own. I'm formerly an architect and passively an ecologist focused on wildlife rehabilitation and animal husbandry. My work is based in and around the human-animal relationship, both in terms of speculative theory and practicality. Today, I will uncover some of the curiosities and stories that inspire me to think about things this way. My first real foray into architectural speculation was strange and furry. It questioned the nature of comfort and experience in domestic architectural spaces through material ambiguity and biological reference. I use secret weapons or hidden references to establish a relationship with the reader that creates a feeling of associative cognizance. In my work, things that we know and understand and can relate to are hidden beneath layers of strange, soft, and furry. These kind of references often include domestic spaces like bathrooms, kitchens, and furniture. This is a method in tactical obfuscation in which I purposefully hide the concrete reference and actively highlight those characteristics which wander around in the uncanny valley, bringing to the surface moments of discomfort, material perversion, and misappropriation. The goal being that the reader is able to simultaneously peel back layers of strange as they explore a world that they inherently understand. To contextualize the work in terms of the seminar this coming week, I think that the power of narrative transcends the bedtime story. Narrative for me is formative, tangible, traceable manifestations of the world around us. It shapes the geographies we move through and the spaces we occupy. In my practice, narrative is treated as a tool to unbind objects from the formative and often practical limitations. I use narrative, myth, superstition as the concrete connective tissue between ideas, forms, and objects. Narrative allows me to work through a process of environmental and object-based extrapolation. In this way, objects and architecture are allowed to grow fur, they're allowed to breathe, they're allowed to twitch, and they can explore their environment. Over the past few years, I've collected a series of tools, some histories, theoretical artifacts, some objects that have become framework for the work that I produce. And in this presentation, I've kind of just outlined a few of those that will help frame the two projects that I'm going to read through towards the end. So the first artifact is the Wardian Case. I recently came across this Wardian Case. It's an artifact of design that made me think about how I use narrative in my work and how architects cross-pollinate formal and theoretical frameworks. In 1829, a physician and amateur botanist named Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward, frustrated with the ill effects of London's polluted air on his herbarium, developed an object of design that would set into motion the effects of globalization as we know it today. The Wardian Case, a composite glass and timber construction, became a highly effective means of transporting live plants across the ocean by limiting exposure to saltwater and inclement weather. The efficacy of this new tool would inspire economic and ecological espionage. The miniature greenhouse would become the mechanism of creating the tea plantations in Assam, help to smuggle the cinchona plant needed for malaria medication out of South America, and move rubber trees from Brazil to establish the global plantations in Southeast Asia that we know today. The case quickly became an essential conceptual framework for me because it has the capacity to produce fertile environments. It has a protective outer layer for undeveloped ideas, but it did not mandate kind of a hermetic state of architecture. It had the capacity to rewrite the global narrative, and as a performative spatial machine, the case shaped the social and economic landscapes of countless communities, spaces, and geographies. The Wardian Case allowed me to go through a process of theoretical, historical, and formal translocations. Artifact number 2. So while exploring the Wardian Case, I was reminded of the Crystal Palace, perhaps by pure analogy of form and material. And then in 1853, Joseph Paxton, who was a horticulturalist, was commissioned to design a 92,000 square meter steel, timber, and glass structure, destined to bring forth a world of technical innovation and technical invention and innovation. The palace would be used to showcase products from countries around the world, driving the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Paxton's creation would be host to the great exhibition of the works of industries of all nations, or what we might know as the First World's Fair. And it displayed 100,000 objects from 15,000 participants, and that included the Wardian Case. Full-size elm trees growing in the park were enclosed within the central exhibition hall. Sparrows, a species of bird, quickly became a nuisance, and shooting the birds was out of the question inside the glass building. The Duke of Wellington, in a conversation with the Queen, offered a solution. Sparrowhawks, ma'am, hoping that the hawks might hunt the sparrows. Like the Wardian Case, the Crystal Palace encourages temporary incubation of unlinked systems and ideas, becoming a narrative collection and a processing machine for architecture design in the future. Artifact number 3, this is less of an artifact and more of a thing. The third artifact is the pigeon. The pigeon is a ubiquitous synanthrope. We've all seen a flock of pigeons in the city, sitting on overhead cables, murmuring through the park. Over the course of history, the pigeon has proven to be adaptable, exploitative, opportunistic species. One that has, in its transition from rock pigeon to domestic pigeon to feral pigeon, avoided mass extinction, occupied nearly every human environment, and posited some fundamental architectural questions about form, material, and association. As architects, we should be interested in the pigeon's ability to reimagine architecture and urbanism in the Anthropocene, but more importantly, intrigued by its inherent pigeon language of form, architecture, and spatial adaptation. The adaptive nature of the pigeon subspecies is a model for architectural form finding and narrative building, but also for thinking about the impact on and the occupation of architecture by non-human species. Artifact 4 is the Pigeon Interlanguage. So the Pigeon Interlanguages are highly adaptable products of intersecting cultural and spatial operations. They were used primarily to describe very basic requirements of spatial, commercial, and materials trade. And then out of necessity, Pigeon languages created a means for trade and commerce. Pigeon languages evolved systematically in context linking interlanguage or in context lacking interlanguage or obvious linguistic commonalities. A false but highly convenient, relevant history, at least for me, of the pigeon etymology refers to the pigeon bird that sometimes carries brief written messages, generally in times before modern means of communication. I use pigeon language as a framework, as a means to think about architectural futures, strange combinations of form, and unrelated references. As a method, pigeon practices force necessity, simplification, an unconditional combination of things, objects, and architectures, often producing some fairly surprising results. The Wardian Case, the Crystal Palace, pigeons, and Pigeon Interlanguages carry a common thread. Each has been highly active in their adaptation to and facilitation of technological, architectural, and geographical changes. Narrative tools for architecture can be as adaptable and exploitative as a pigeon, and as globally and commercially intersectional as pigeon languages. This innate ability to simultaneously shapeshift and then simultaneously augment their context is a critical component of my own practice, the narratives and the architectures that I create. The fifth artifact, and perhaps the most important that I'd like to describe is, and this has had the largest influence on the work that I'm making, is animal architectures or superstitions. So animals, domestic and wild, exist within the urban spatial context as a manifestation of magic, myth, and superstition, but perhaps more pertinently as a means to occupy physical space in the world. Animals manifest as a hidden but ubiquitous architectural reference in two ways. The first, as an established means of human survivability, giving us the capacity to occupy, understand, and navigate the world around us, providing a means of transport, shelter, environmental stimulus, and food resource. Animals and their products formed an essential part of commerce and trade, established as commodity money. The money cowrie shell is said to be the graphic reference for the traditional Chinese character for money. The second reference are animal synanthropes, like the pigeon or the rat, living explicitly in our urban spaces. The pigeon and rat are signs of robust human settlement, establishing that infrastructures we have created provide resources and architectures sufficient for both human and animal occupation. The animal-human relationship can be drawn back to the origins of humanity, human settlement, architecture, and spatial occupation. What's most interesting in the context of cultural manifestation and architectural permanence are the numerous parallel narratives that wildlife occupy when we talk about design and making in the contemporary time frame. Animals permeate our culture in as many ways as it might seem imaginable. They're not only present as creatures that go bump in the night, but as influences of the space we occupy, the things we eat, the clothes we wear, and the medicines we take. Before permanence in architecture, nomadic humans were using animal parts to exist in a state of impermanence. First nations in Africa and the Americas followed the movements of wildlife as a means of survival, hunting for food, and using their hides and bones to create temporary living spaces. We use animals as transport, once domesticated, as a means of mechanized power in agriculture. As pastoralism followed, our inherent reliance and relationship with wildlife increased. We bred and domesticated wild animals and established architectures explicitly for their husbandry. We chose geographies reflecting on the needs of our domestic animals, and we decided on long-term living spaces based on access to water and food for our domestic stock. Animals were physically transformed into architecture as some kind of magic was abound, setting the path for future architectural systems and semiotics. Bones would become concrete, steel, and timber structural systems, and skins would become the envelope and help to articulate the apertures. The animal became the Wardian Case for human spatial occupation, and literally transporting and supporting us through the development of time. So, based on the 5 listed frameworks, the Wardian Case, the Crystal Palace, pigeons, pigeon languages, animal systems, I'd like to present 2 somewhat contrasted projects. The first I'll be talking about, I'm basically just going to read through this, is The Illusions of Occupancy, which was written as an entry to Room 1000, which is the UC Berkeley Architecture Department journal, and this year's theme was magic. The second is called My Brother Ernest, and it was written as a competition entry for Fairy Tales, an annual competition hosted by Blank Space. So may I believe that that's something we'll be working on or looking at next week during the seminar. So I'm going to start with illusions of occupancy. Continually moving towers bring the landscape to life. Oil rigs, aesthetically naturalized to the Los Angeles geography in their vast numbers, are camouflaged to the human eye. Images from the 1930s depict Los Angeles as visibly forested by fields of coniferous imposters. Before them, ranchers and cattlemen had sliced up and laid claim to unclaimed land. Unnatural human-made steel oil derricks, exhuming, exhaling, and consuming the earth they stand on, became the frontier for the new human habitat. In the dream factory of the Western world, as one resource diminished, another ongoing project emerged to redraw the post-agrarian landscape. Driven by the search for value in the now barren land, the acts of reimagining the city or being reimagined by the city became defining factors in Los Angeles' urban ecology. More importantly, is the illusion of magic or the mistaken identity that has fostered the beating heart of the city. Her jaunt included traveling through Koreatown, East Hollywood, Larchmont, Windsor Square, and Hancock Park. She returned just after a few days. A bioresident of central and downtown boroughs, C-144 travels for work and for food. Transient during the good months, bedded down permanently only once a year. Reliant on garbage sorters, stray cats, rodents, twice yearly fruiting fig trees, food is plentiful in the boroughs. C-144 understands the city in terms of continuous movement. Fluent in her diffusion through the urban texture, she navigates alleyways, backyards, sewerage, and storm drain systems like pathways, roads, and highways. C-144 and her community reject the bounds of their reservations in Elysian and Griffith Park. Instead, concrete Los Angeles is redrawn into 5 boroughs: South Los Angeles, Central Los Angeles, Downtown Los Angeles, Hollywood, Los Feliz, and Northeast Los Angeles, each defined by massive transport infrastructures and natural geographies. Through acts of resilience, displaced flora and fauna innovate to reoccupy urban spaces, occurring naturally by means of an extreme adaptation to human-made environments. If the process of adaptation is understood in terms of codependency and cohabitation, wildlife has an innate ability to redefine human architectural artifice as a new natural environment. Consistent with the transformative nature of Los Angeles, the new natural landscape is an incubator for emergent forms of occupancy. C-144 is testament to this. This matriarch of a marginalized, albeit successful community, draws and reimagines Los Angeles as a new Coyote Landscape. The new natural landscape is rich with resources. It provides infrastructure for shelter and safe transit for its diverse population. Co-occupied by both human and non-human species, the city is continuously remapped and redrawn by its inhabitants. C-144 and others like her engage the city as a large, expansive home defined by weather, seasons, and food source. Imagine a home with a kitchen that is decentralized and distributed across the city, a living room stretched between West Hollywood and Koreatown, and a secluded underground bedroom in Silver Lake. Corridors and stairwells drawn out across the entire urban ranges and boroughs, creating an entanglement of network pathways. C-144 has survived and raised multiple litters in a densely populated area with very little untouched habitat. Fluent in her understanding of architecture and human spaces, she's never visited municipal lands like Elysian or Griffith Park, but persists entirely within the confines of extremely urbanized habitats. C-144, a female coyote, Canis latrans, provides a glimpse at the underpinnings of an incredible illusion, one in which the human environment, gilded by fantasy of imperialism over nature, exists only as a continuation or translation of the natural environment. Some side notes about this piece. Wild animals help us navigate fears and feelings of inferiority. This idea can be uncovered across the world. It traverses all cultures and customs. Coyote 144 presents a case for the consistent reoccupation and reinterpretation of architectural space. In this project, I'm specifically leading the reader through the city under the guise of a human, and reflecting on spaces and objects that they might understand or would have experienced. The story is a vessel for exploring urban space without the limitations of human spatial needs. Revealing the real identity of the protagonist at the end of the journal piece is a tool that I'm using to trigger feelings of compassion through surprise. So the next project, and I'm going to apologize for this in advance because it's very strange. The next project was done for the fairy tales competition, and it is called My Brother Ernest. At some point, the dust just never settled. Some deliberate for a while about its origin, but it was clear. The dust simply had no intention of returning to the surface it had once called home. Many other elements would follow suit. A fried sun tomato filled with warm orange-colored liquid floats motionless between the clouds. A sucklet bathes in its round belly. He is the keeper of the sun and its warm tomato soup. Friends had felt similar effects, feeling light of foot, gravity now seemed seemingly on their side. The change was gradual, pleasant at worst, and for many the change was welcome, even if it meant living upside down. For a while, a few years, everything, even the ocean, in large, slowly undulating bubbles, floated. The ground was mostly gone, consumed, ground up and eaten as paste on sandwiches. That soon too would run out. Eventually, everything was gone, consumed with the exception of a few animals, some unwanted but all needed. What wildlife remained were a variety of mutations and transformations, all very selfish genetic modifications made before the dust never settled. Creatures and objects lost and gained new meaning and purpose. Lines were blurred and tails were stretched. With all the weight of the world removed, a new gravity allowed the oceans to lift, first in parts, then all at once. The new ocean that would form against the stratosphere, the upside up sea, was filled with young ciglets, shark purses, and asparagus shoots. The pig shark and his sucklets would swim slowly between the ventricles of the sweetheart trees, sharing close intimacies beneath the calm surface of the ocean. Things that were considerably close to normal, a little far-fetched, at times a little stretched. Right before the dust never settled, the human form had taken true form of efficiency. A long neck for voyeuristic tendencies, specifically for peering at others' phones, a single large eye for low light conditions, and a blue skin perfect for absorbing warmth from the tomato sun. On Wednesdays, right after tea, Ernest would launch himself upwards towards his boat, which floated calmly above his jellyfish home in a grove of trees. The journey to the boat was brief. Ernest floated towards the sweetheart trees, flapping his short arms violently to direct his ascent. It was far from graceful. His fishing pig, Bert, lived on the boat full time, taking weekends off occasionally. I imagined that fishing was a pleasant experience, that Ernest bobbed quietly in the water, talking softly to Bert, explaining at length the process of asparagus drilling. Pig sharks were delightful creatures. Bert had started as a pig shark. He had chosen this line of work when presented with options on his first birthday, to be a groundhog or a pig shark. Before the dust never settled, the earth was a solemn place. The land was covered in pig farms and oceans filled with albino sharks and jellyfish, so much so that when the dust began to rise, there was a mass migration of creatures, unthinkable acts of crossbreeding, and untold romance between the creatures. As time shifted, sweetheart cheese would form, and the last remaining octopi would rip the hearts out from their lovers, holding them tight whilst dangling their tentacles on the ground, often tickling passers-by. And now the oceans are filled with pig sharks who suckle the sweetheart nectars, and the skies with the jellyfish who glimmer in the sunlight. My brother Ernest, which is pronounced Ernest, oh, he was so smart. He invented all these practical methods for survival in the new world. He built anti-gravity groundhogs, jellyfish houses, and fished upside up for ciglets, shark piglets. He was a seamstress, proudly wearing his own handiwork. He never went to bed without his pajamas on. Ernest was a realist, practical and focused. He would later tell me that it was his uncanny disdain for frivolity that helped him survive the floating years. Beneath it all, I believed he was devoutly spiritual. My mother always worried that he would be alone in life. In hindsight, that was almost going to be inevitable. Creating a jellyfish home was an artful act. It was both practical and beautiful at the same time. Ernest would pause for a moment once the jelly had been tethered to the ground, staring wide-eyed into the sky. He told me that during the nighttime, the houses glowed and flickered like stars when he was up on the upside-up sea looking down. Usually found floating around the upside-up sea and the earth, unaffected by gravitational shifts. The jellyfish would descend towards earth as they approached death, and if done properly, Ernest would catch the jellyfish just as they began to fall upwards. He had struck up a deal with them, exchanging their life for his gravity. And when the warmth of the juicy red sun left us for the evening, the jellyfish houses would glow, their yellow tentacles lighting up the warm, soft groundhog floor. In his spare time, his asparagus drill would take them down through the hard earth surface deep into the gene pool. Mother once said he was an excellent swimmer. Ernest realized that the subtle internal vibrations of the asparagus would slowly chisel its way through the body of the earth. And at the center, he would exchange used genes for new genes and collect and deposit his collection of stones, which he sometimes found in the kidney of his fishing pig Bert. What confounded me is that he would feverishly cover up his excavation when he was complete, and then proceed to fling his asparagus drill up and over his head, grinning widely at the sight of it spinning uncontrollably through the air. The asparagus grows amongst the sweetheart trees and can be harvested at midday when the tomato sun is at its warmest. A quote by my brother Ernest. So some side notes on my brother Ernest. My Brother Ernest is a framework for understanding the development of architecture, a reaction to globalization, and acute localization of theory and practice. This project is an exploration of unknown territories, an exaggeration of animal-human narratives, and an extension of boundaries and limitations of our relationship with animals and our impact on the environment that we live. The story takes advantage of our current reality in a constant state of change and subject to constant redefinition. It specifically plays into the fears and insecurities of our world and our existence in the world, eliciting feelings about climate change, habitat loss, and prevalence of invasive species. My Brother Ernest also talks about our natural ability to adapt and overcome times of intense change and physical duress, a skill that's specifically and very much needed right now. And I'll just quickly conclude with a few thoughts about things. So stories, superstitions, and narrative are a means for us to cross the threshold between imagination, imagined reality, and reality itself. And like the Wardian Case, narrative frameworks are a test chamber and a mobile fertility clinic for architectural ideas that would otherwise have no space in contemporary practice. Narratives exist in a constant state of modernist rejection, and they essentially, for me, an embellished machine for understanding the environment around us. They're in many ways a formwork for post-modernity, a vessel of new non-ironic forms of poetry, accelerated technological integration, and uncanny aesthetic discoveries of form. This is where I situate my own work, where narrative is a powerfully liberating theoretical practice for architecture, carrying with it desires, dreams, and fragmented objects destined for a fertile future. And that is that.
Thank you so much, Joris. That was exceptional. This is a very personal reflection, and I hope I'm not going to be embarrassing or too nostalgic. But as you were speaking, I was reminded of something in first year when we had a project in Sunnyside or something to make a little, I don't know what it was, like a kiosk. Do you remember the project?
Yeah.
No, I don't know. I don't remember the brief, but I did something where I appropriated taxis almost as the way you describe pigeons. And you teased me all year that the project should be called taxidermy. And I think that you are still quite interested in that idea. However many years on it is now, 13 or however many.
Absolutely obsessed.
Yeah, but I find that really, really amazing, because I don't think in first year that I had that much command over my interests. And I think it's amazing that you had seeds of things that were so interesting in the beginning. And also, I think, although we did have a wonderful architectural experience in our school, amongst ourselves as colleagues and things, I think we understand what the general landscape of architectural schools in the country and continent is. And yeah, I'm just reflecting on how exceptional it is that you were able to hold that seed in those environments and that you're still doing that now. I wonder if you have any reflection on that. Also, I think having worked across these geographies, it's really amazing to be able to see and feel things around your personal interests, the desert and so on, also seep into your work in really interesting ways.
So I'll just say one thing. So this last project I presented, which I really love this project. I worked with 3 other people on this project, all 3 of which are third language English speakers from mainland China. And one of the most amazing things that happened was that we were lost in translation almost the entire time. So the kind of creation of the images and that was all this kind of very, we're using Google Translate and kind of building through things and trying to translate, the attempt to translate an upside down up sea and a fishing pig from English to Mandarin was I mean, just an amazing process. And so that's just something worth knowing. Li Jun, Yu Chen, and Yina were I mean, amazing to work with. Just so you know, this is not entirely my work, and we all contribute very equally to this project. They were very nice to kind of give me permission to use this work. Reflecting on kind of, look, the work that I'm presenting is it comes in at two levels. One, it's weirdly personal. I grew up in a place that's all about wildlife rehabilitation. In fact, the place where I am right now, which is this lovely farm somewhere in central Namibia, we have a rehab center here for birds of prey. That's what we do here. So my every day is kind of based around wildlife rehabilitation and husbandry. And so I've really had that kind of parrot sitting on my shoulder for the last, I don't know, 30 odd years. And it has no intention of leaving. So in that way, I can define your narrative, but I also think there's a question of, you know, colonizing other people's kind of narratives. And so, and I think that this is my narrative, and kind of this is my framework that I work against. And I like that it kind of pushes into other frameworks, but it kind of has its own track, and I think that's really important. And I think that there's a lot, especially in the way, having taught the last couple of years and seen some of the kind of systems at play, I really see an encouragement of people to almost globalize in a way that doesn't foster kind of personal futures or like individual futures. It's like everybody's making the white gaudy bups. I call them the new modernists. And for what? And so I think that, you know, that's where narrative and things like the Wardian Case feel really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, I will just underscore in saying, you mean you have to come as you are, right? Because you are enough. And like, there's nothing new about the modernists, right? I mean, it's the same. you know what I mean? And it's been done for so long. Like, what are you bringing to it? I was really drawn in by what you said, because when you said animal architecture, I honestly expected it to go another way, but I was actually pleasantly surprised. But also more from the context from which we come. Like, two things always stay in my mind, that this part of Africa, Southern Africa, has like maybe the largest variety of rodents anywhere, right? And secondly, that the relationship between the common housefly and human beings can be traced back to like caves in Zimbabwe, right? So that symbiotic relationship which you speak to, it's from here, it's of us, right? And you know, in the same way that you can track the sort of colonial globalization through the Wardian Case. I mean, you could look at it through commodities, right? You spoke of tea. You can speak to like palm oil. You can speak to different commodities, and for me, like always, like the jacaranda is one that always hits me, right? Like if you're in Pretoria, in Harare, you know, it's this Australian tree that's just like everywhere, and we love it, you know, and we think it's ours, but it's not. This adaptability, which in a way is not from us. Like, I think that's interesting. Like when one speaks to, the British love to call it the climate emergency, right? So a friend of mine, who you know of, Samaya Safia. Safia is like quite the fundamentalist with regards to saving the world. But part of her recycling strategy is to leave the organics at the bottom of the garden for the urban foxes, right, in London, because you know they inhabit these spaces. You had the coyotes with the bins, and she's like, well, you know, eliminate the danger of the plastics and etc., and just make that part of the practice, is what she does, which I I find so fascinating, right? Because we're not adapting at the speed, you know. I mean, you speak to like the mammoth bones and the fur. I mean, the whole point I always feel of architecture is to compensate for the lack of genetic adaptability in humans, right? Like we need to build shelters because we are not covered in hair, right? And we can't regulate ourselves the way in which animals do. And so we co-opt that ability. So yeah, I really enjoyed that. I thought that was fun. But yeah, I'm curious to know, like within your Coyote project, you sort of did these little dioramas in a way, which are like snapshots of the city, but then you also had the larger map. So were each of those like those points in the map?
Yeah, so it's an ongoing project right now. We're working with National Park Service in Los Angeles. And so just, I mean, to give people a bit more context, you know, I started a couple of years ago, we did these very speculative projects. The Coyote project is quite new. The speculative projects are a little bit older, and they're a little bit more in the imagined reality, like the imagined world. But the Coyote project, I reached out to National Park Service. I said, look, I understand that you have like a growing, let's call it a coyote problem, but it's more of a problem of just understanding. And so I reached out to them and I said, is there a way that we can build a series of information / graphics / mapping tools for the coyote? You know, it was a bit of a self-serving project because I wanted to make the drawings, but
at what point did you co-opt them? Like, was there like a 300-word abstract? Was there like a sketch drawing, or was it just literally a call?
And I think, I mean, one of the things in the wildlife world is that there are massive projects. And there is a very kind of low level of incoming, let's say, intellect to try and deal with those projects. A lot of it is very scientific. It's a science paper. It sits in the office of the administration, and then that's where it ends. And so I said to them, look, let's produce information or architectures, or I'm calling this architectures, but let's produce a series of drawings that can inform the public in a way. And that's what kickstarted that. And they said, look, we'll give you as much information as you need. They gave us the maps, a lot of which they keep quiet. They try and keep secret because otherwise you have these wildlife vigilantes.
Yeah.
So each one of those points is each one of those points is a point of interest in the city where coyote that lives in Los Angeles, and so each one of those points is a point of interest where she's really kind of either hunting, gathering, sleeping, avoiding people, doing something. And so so as I go, I'm slowly building.
Sorry to interrupt you. While you're talking about it, can you go through some of the drawings as you're speaking? Thelma's asking about the same project, I think.
So I'll quickly have a look. All right, so these are a couple of different spaces looking at downtown Los Angeles. So this over here is the 5, and this is downtown itself. And this is where, I'm sure you've maybe heard of this, the SciArc school. So SciArc is based over here. In fact, that's SciArc over there. And so this is kind of very kind of populated area for Coyote 144. She operates a little bit further down towards the beach area where there's a lot of suburbia and a little bit more greenery. And then some of these are very, they're very loose because they, you don't really get, there's not really very good documented information about how coyotes operate. But recently there was that wonderful video of the badger and the coyote running down a pipe together. I don't know if you saw that. It was kind of floating, strange thing.
To American. But I love this sort of visual iconography, right? So there's this like complete duality within, say, my Brother Ernest, which is quite intense, and where these can also be, I mean, like my favorite thing about IKEA is just the instructions, right?
Yeah.
I think that's the best thing about it. Like they do nice drawings. Beyond, like honestly, like I just want the catalog of IKEA drawings. And in a way, you've sort of done that here, where it kind of, I mean, although you've written like, you know, Silver Lake, which is like a suburb, it can almost be like, you know, an archetype of a space, which I enjoy about this type of drawing.
So I mean, so the intention here was to kind of take advantage of, let's call it contemporary drawing practices in architectural education, because this is what at least my students were being at a first year level we were being mandated to teach how to draw with lines, how to use the axonometric, how to use the plan oblique. And so in my mind, using these as the tool to kind of represent wildlife in architecture was for me the next step, because it started kind of equalize the playing field. Suddenly we were, you know, if I can talk about human X in Silver Lake with a house and the detail for that, I can do the same for a coyote living underneath the same house.